He was born in the ruins. His mother never told him who his father was, but the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching said everything. Her eyes didn't hold love. They held memory, pain, regret, maybe even shame. And she never touched him gently. He learned early not to ask questions. In what used to be Berlin, after the war, there were no answers, just ghosts. His neighborhood was full of them. Bombed-out homes with walls ripped open like wounds, furniture half buried in ash, burnt dolls, wedding photos, bricks blackened by heat that never cooled inside people's minds. He didn't know the word for it then, but people whispered it. Liberation. The day the Red Army came. But what he saw in the alleys and cellars didn't look like liberation. It looked like girls with bruises who never spoke again. It looked like mothers walking strangely and refusing to say why. It looked like silence and screaming, but never at the same time. If you're enjoying this video, like and subscribe to the Grimveil channel for more dark dives you won't forget. His mother kept a small knife under the floorboard, not for food, for safety. She had used it once, on herself. When they broke the door and dragged her down the hall, she had tried, but they were too many. They laughed when they found it. He had been hiding in the closet, pressed against coats that still smelled like better days. He heard her voice crack. He heard boots. He heard men speaking in a language he didn't know, and he heard something he never wanted to hear again, her silence after they left. She never looked at him the same after that day. Maybe he reminded her, or maybe she couldn't bear to see anything she had to protect and failed to. Some said it happened to thousands, others said millions, but no one really knew, because the records were buried. And the women were told to forget. Some weren't allowed to speak. Others were too afraid. The Soviets called it victory. The Germans called it shame. But no one asked the women what to call it. And the children born from it? They were mistakes. Living proof of something no one wanted to remember. He was one of those children. He grew up in a city that pretended nothing happened. The rubble was cleared, the flags were replaced, and the walls were painted over. But beneath the paint, the cracks were still there. The city smelled of coal smoke and secrets. People didn't talk about the war. They talked around it. They said, "those times," or "back then." They never said what happened in the cellars. They never said what happened when the soldiers came. His mother walked every day with her head down. She cleaned offices by night and stared at her hands like they were someone else's. Sometimes she would touch the scar on her wrist and whisper under her breath. Not prayers, not names, just fragments of sentences that never reached the end. He tried to ask once. She slapped him before he finished the question. Then she cried, holding him so tight he couldn't breathe. After that, she never hit him again. But she never answered either. There were other women like her. They didn't gather. They didn't form groups. They just existed, scattered, broken, carrying the same invisible wound. Some turned to drink. Some turned to silence. Some turned to rivers. The newspapers called them suicides, but the city knew better. Everyone knew better. The river carried their bodies away quietly, like it was part of an agreement. When he went to school, the teachers taught about the heroes, the generals, the glory of rebuilding. They said the past was gone, that Germany was new again. But the boys whispered. They whispered about the Russian soldiers who had taken their mothers, about the babies that didn't belong, about neighbors who disappeared, and sometimes they whispered about him. He didn't have to be told. He could see it in their faces. He was different. His hair, his skin, the shape of his eyes. He didn't look like the other boys. And when the teacher called his name, there was always a pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone knows something, but they'll never say it out loud. His mother told him once, in a rare moment of honesty, that he should never ask who his father was, that some truths were too heavy for anyone to carry. "You were born after the end," she said, but the end never really ended. He started to notice the silence everywhere, in the way people avoided certain streets, in the way men turned away when a woman screamed, in the way laughter always died too quickly. It was like the whole country had decided to hold its breath. The war had moved on, but its shadow never left. It seeped into everything: food, air, names, memories. He began to think maybe everyone was haunted. Maybe the whole nation was living with ghosts. And maybe he was one of them. He read history books when he got older. They told stories of triumph. The Red Army sweeping across Europe, defeating fascism, saving the world. The soldiers were heroes. The flags were red. The songs were loud. There were parades, medals, statues. But when he walked the streets of Berlin, he didn't see statues. He saw mothers flinch at the sound of boots. He saw women cross the street when they heard Russian. He saw grandmothers cry when no one was looking. And he realized that something was missing from the books, a silence shaped like a scream. The soldiers came in the name of liberation, but they didn't bring peace. They brought hunger. They brought fire. They brought something worse than death. In town after town, village after village, women were dragged from homes, churches, and hospitals. Some were taken in front of their children. Others were killed when they fought back. The youngest were barely 12. The oldest were over 80. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't random. It was a flood, a system, a punishment. Some commanders knew. Some encouraged it. Some wrote it off as the price of victory, a kind of twisted revenge against a nation already in ruins. And the men who committed it? Many never faced consequences. Some returned home as decorated heroes. Others stayed, occupying forces in lands they had already shattered. The world turned its face away. The Allies knew. The Germans knew. The Soviets denied everything. And so the women were left alone, broken, bleeding, forced to smile through teeth clenched in fear. Some tried to report what had happened. Doctors wrote reports. Midwives gave testimony. But it was always buried, always erased. To speak was betrayal. To admit it was shame. So the truth died in hospital basements, behind closed doors, in the quiet of orphanages where unwanted children cried themselves to sleep. He was one of those children. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a war, but the war was in him, not by choice, by birth. And every time he tried to understand what had happened, someone would tell him it was better not to ask, that the past was complicated, that the Russians had suffered too, that everyone had done terrible things. But he knew that wasn't true. Some things weren't just terrible. They were unforgivable. They called it victory, but it felt like something else. It felt like betrayal, dressed in uniform. He once met a woman who had survived it. She was older, her hands shaking as she poured tea. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. She looked at him for a long time before speaking, and when she did, her voice was dry, like paper that had been folded too many times. She said she was 16 when it happened. They had heard rumors that the soldiers were coming. It was safer to stay inside, that if you hid in the cellar, they might pass over you. But the cellar wasn't deep enough, not when they were looking for bodies. They didn't knock, they didn't ask. They kicked in the door and dragged them out by their hair. Her mother tried to protect her. She died screaming. Her father was already gone, taken by the war. She was alone, and they didn't care. She didn't say what they did. She didn't have to. It was in her voice, in the way her fingers trembled when she lit a cigarette, in the way she kept glancing at the door, even after all these years. No one helped her after. The neighbors pretended not to see. The soldiers were still there, drinking in the square, laughing in the streets. The officers said they'd investigate, but she never heard from them again. The hospital treated her like she was diseased. The priest told her to pray. The police told her to forget. And so she did. She forgot how to feel, how to trust, how to sleep. She forgot how to be touched without flinching, but she didn't forget what they did. She told them she had a child after, a girl. She couldn't raise her. Every time she looked at her, she saw boots and blood and pain. So she gave her away, to a home. She told herself it was mercy, but it never stopped hurting. Thousands of women like her never spoke, not because they couldn't, but because no one wanted to hear it. Society didn't make room for victims, only for survivors, and even then, only quiet ones. The ones who talked were called liars. The ones who cried were called weak. The ones who kept going were called strong. But they weren't. They were hollow, carved out by what they could never say. He remembered that woman for the rest of his life. Not for her story, but for her silence. It was the same silence his mother carried, the same silence he saw in the mirror. He once asked a historian why it was never taught, why the books skipped over the nights, the cellars, the vanished women. The man adjusted his glasses and said, "It's complicated." But it wasn't. It was just inconvenient. Inconvenient to remember that the victors could be monsters. Inconvenient to admit that not all wounds were visible. Inconvenient to write about justice when justice was never served. He found others like him. Quiet men and women with uncertain names, old photographs that didn't match their faces, birth certificates that listed no father. They carried their identities like unwanted luggage, too heavy to leave behind, too strange to open in public. Some spent their whole lives searching for answers. Others stopped looking. He didn't know if his father was still alive. He didn't care. What mattered was the silence left behind, the way it had shaped his mother, the way it had shaped him. There were no memorials for people like them, no plaques, no flowers, just empty chairs at family gatherings and unanswered questions passed down through generations. He watched as nations built monuments to the fallen, soldiers in bronze, flags in stone. He saw wreaths laid on graves, presidents bowing their heads. But no one bowed for the women who were never buried. No one built statues for the mothers who never recovered. No one wrote songs for the children who weren't supposed to exist. They said the war ended in 1945, but for some it never did. It lived on in nightmares, in hospital files sealed shut, in stories whispered and then forgotten. It lived on in the way some women never remarried, in the way some children never knew where they came from, in the way entire countries erased what they didn't want to remember. He learned that truth doesn't die, it just gets buried. And sometimes the only way to honor it is to dig it up again, to speak what was silenced, to name what was hidden, to remember what they tried to erase. Because the victims weren't just bodies, they were lives, names, families, futures that were stolen and never returned. And the children left behind? They were history's afterthought, but they were never mistakes.